All right, so let's get started. So welcome everyone to the Indian Institute of Management Ahmedabad's Research and Publication Seminar Series, or Webinar Series this time. So thanks for joining, all of you. Delighted to welcome Professor Andrew Hoffman, the distinguished speaker for today's webinar. The title of Professor Hoffman's talk is How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate. And in his talk, Professor Hoffman today will explore what causes people to reject or accept the scientific consensus on climate change. He's going to examine the opposing cultural lenses through which the science of climate change is interpreted. And he's also going to offer some insights on ways to overcome the divide. Professor Andrew Hoffman is the Holcomb U.S. Professor of Sustainable Enterprise at the University of Michigan. He holds joint appointments in the Ross School of Business as well as the School for Environment and Sustainability. Professor Hoffman is a leading scholar in the fields of organizational theory and business sustainability, and has published over 100 articles and book chapters and 18 books. His work has been covered in numerous media outlets, and he's served on numerous research committees of the National Academies of Sciences and others, and has won numerous, of course, prestigious research awards. So we are delighted, Professor Hoffman, to have you today. Before I hand over, a few quick rules for the audience. Please keep your microphones muted at all times. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. And we do have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, but it's possible that Professor Hoffman may choose to respond in between. And so just so the audience knows, the session is being recorded. So with that, over to you, Andy. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll share my slides right here. Do that. It's amazing how adept we've become at this medium, navigating around. And I was telling people at the beginning how disappointed I am to be giving my first talk in India from my living room in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've wanted to go to India for a long time, and I hope one day to be able to, but we make do with what we have. So what I want to talk today is how culture shapes the climate change debate. And I also want to illustrate some things in this talk about technique. Another avenue of my work has been around the idea of the importance of academic scholars to bring their work into public and political discourse, which means being able to communicate in ways that are accessible to a general public. And so I'm going to try and do that here as well. And one aspect or one technique for doing that, and perhaps you've heard of it and perhaps you've even done it yourself, is I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. And so that's what I'm going to do in my talk. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you what I tell you, and then tell you what I told you. And the two bookends, the beginning and the end, are going to be stories. And an important device for communicating with people, academic or otherwise, is that stories stick. You may not remember my talk, but you may remember the stories. And that, I think, is a crucial tool to put in your tool belt for communicating science. So let me begin. I'm going to tell a story. It's a true story. They're all true stories. A number of years ago, I was invited by the development office at the University of Michigan to meet with a potential donor. And he was interested in business sustainability, and he wanted to meet with me and maybe make a donation to the university. The only time I had free was 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I met with this donor and the development officer. I showed up in the room, cradling my cup of coffee, still waking up. And I'm faced with a conference table and the donor across the table, the development officer to my right. Before I even sat down, the potential donor said, "I want you to know I think the scientific review process is corrupt." Those were his opening words. And that kind of woke me up. And I said, "What do you think of a university based on that system?" He said, "I think that university is corrupt as well." He went on to say that he thought climate change was a hoax. And we kicked that around for a little while. And then he turned his sights on me and he said, now, can you tell me why you hate capitalism and why you want to destroy the market by teaching environmental issues in a business school? And so we kicked that around for a little while. And then he said, now, do you know why Earth Day is on the day it's on? And I said, at this point, I was getting pretty punchy. I said, no, why don't you tell me, why is Earth Day on the day it's on? He said, because that's Karl Marx's birthday. So I turned to the development officer at that point and said, what's our agenda here this morning? And this potential donor jumped in and said, I want to buy you a ticket to the Heartland Conference. Now, if you're not familiar, the Heartland Conference is the #1 climate skeptics conference in the country, in the world. I did a quick scan of my calendar. I had a conflict. I politely declined. The meeting ended. And the more I thought about it, I left that meeting really mad. I really felt that I'd been deceived. I didn't think this guy was sincere. But the more I talked about it with colleagues, the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that everything he said hung together. I mean, it all represented a consistent worldview. It wasn't a worldview I shared, but it was a worldview nonetheless that allowed him to look at the same science I do and see something completely different. And I started to become fascinated because I do study cultures, I do institutions, how they form, how they change, how they guide our behavior. And so I decided I'm gonna start to study climate change as a cultural issue. And I think this is a very potent lens for anyone out there who's thinking about a direction to go, of trying to think about the cultural dimensions of science in general, climate change in particular. So I started papers, you know how it all works, and it culminates in a stream of research. And I'm going to summarize it really quickly right now. And that is that for many people, the debate over climate change is not about CO2 or climate models or radiative forcing. It's about values that they feel are threatened by an acceptance of climate change, and they will fight to defend them. If you can recognize this, you can start to understand why the schism in the debate. If you continue to rest on the idea that it's scientific, you will not be able to get across that divide. There's the talk. I've told you what I'm going to tell you. You can go to sleep now if you like, or we can go through the rest of it, and then I'll end with another story, and then we'll open up for Q&A. In the United States, science has become extremely politicized. This is a study done by the Pew Research Center, and the white dot is surveys of AAAS scientists, the American Association for the Advancement of Scientists, and science, and the blue dot is US adults. And the key point is that gap. And you can see climate change is mostly due to human activity, a 37-point gap. Is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? A 51-point gap. All the way down the line, we could even add to this COVID. There are plenty of people in this country who don't believe COVID is real. Plenty of people in the country who are choosing not to vaccinate. I even talked to a doctor at the University of Michigan Hospital who's treating a patient for COVID who doesn't believe COVID exists. This is a cause for concern. It's also quite fascinating. What's also fascinating is India doesn't seem to be suffering, at least on the environment, from the same problem. This report came out from the World Economic Forum, and you can see how much do you trust what scientists say about the environment. India is at the top of the list, 86%. United States is at the bottom of the list, 45%. And so maybe in the Q&A, and as you hear my remarks, you can ask yourself, what is it different about India? Why is the phenomenon I'm describing not happening in India and happening in the United States? And a second question, are there issues where it is happening in India? Because I could be talking about climate change, I could be talking about COVID, I could be talking about nanotech, any number of issues. The phenomenon, the dynamics are the same on the extent to which or the reasons why people accept it. I want to start by trying to get warmed up on the idea of climate change as a cultural issue. And I want to highlight the distinction between a scientific consensus and a social consensus. And this is important because I got plenty of scientists who think once the science reaches a consensus, the conversation's over. And my approach is that the work has just begun because you have to convince people that it's real and then convince people to do something about it. Those of us in a business school know that that's the essence of management. Too many of our students think you just come up with the right idea and you're done. It's like, oh boy, the hard work is convincing people that it's true and convincing them to do it. And that's the real work. So think, for example, cigarettes and human health. For decades, the public was told that cigarettes cause cancer. For decades, the public did not believe that consensus. And it took a long time, decades, for us to reach a social consensus that cigarettes are bad for you. We were fed a constant diet of information that both reflected and perpetuated our beliefs. Here are some ads from the 1950s and 60s. And you can see, here's a doctor recommending you don't smoke Camels. Your dentist recommends you smoke Viceroys. And scientists and educators, us, smoke Kent with the micronite filter. So it's an interesting phenomenon to think about. Why did this happen? And then how did we get to where we are now? We do have a social consensus that cigarettes cause cancer. The reason you know this is that you're not afraid to talk to people you don't know, because you know that everyone around us, for the most part, accepts this as true. Of course, there's always some people who don't accept it. There are people, there's a flat earth society. There's always a fringe, but the mainstream society, there is a social consensus, what Emil Durkheim called a social fact. How do you know that there's not a social consensus on climate change in the United States? Is people won't talk about it with family or friends. You can see that bottom green line. People who do not talk, only occasionally or rarely, if never, the black line, 62% of Americans don't bring it up. It's joined sex, politics, and religion as a topic you don't bring up in polite company. That's how you know you don't have a social consensus. Sorry about that. And importantly, the idea of climate change as a cultural issue, there is a clear divide on who believes in climate change and who doesn't. Typically on environmental issues, the demographic variables are these. It's women more than men, young more than old, urban more than rural, educated more than less so, affluent more than less so. In the United States, the coasts more than the middle, and then Democrat more than Republican, liberal more than conservative. On climate change, most of those variables go away, and the dominant correlate with someone's belief on climate change is their political party affiliation. This is some really nice work done by Aaron McCright and Riley Dunlap, and what they tracked between 2001 and 2010, you can see on the bottom, those who identified as Republicans, decreasing belief in climate change over that period of time. Same with conservatives on the top graph. And then over that same period of time, increasing Democrats, increasing liberal. I'm going to come back to this graph later in the talk to bring things up to date. That 2010 is 10 years ago. And some interesting things have been happening since then. But this is, to my mind, a smoking gun that there's a cultural dynamic here. Are Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives taught about climate change or science in a different way? No. Do they look at it through a particular cultural lens that allows them or compels them to see things differently? Yes. And so if we can start to understand what those dynamics are, we can start to understand how to overcome them. And so I want to offer 4 points from social psychology to try and examine and explore what's going on here. The first is we all use cognitive filters, all of us. We use what's called motivated reasoning. We are presented with information. If it's uncertain, we will struggle with it and we will accept it readily. If it confirms our worldview, we will reject it or resist it if it challenges our worldview. We all do this. We do this in simple ways. We do this in complicated ways. A simple way, I'm driving down the road. I hear a rattle in the front quarter of my car. What am I thinking? Must be a stone, loose bolt. Why? I'm motivated to the conclusion that I don't have to go to the mechanic. Men on health do this a lot. I feel an ache. It'll go away. It's just a minor sprain. What are you doing? You're motivated to the conclusion that you don't have to go to the doctor. So we all do this. And Jonathan Haidt, who has done some really nice work in psychology of these processes, describes it. And we're faced with complex information. We don't approach it like a lawyer. We approach it, we don't approach it like a scientist, we approach it like a lawyer. What he says is, when we're faced with this information, we have an emotional reaction really quickly for reasons I'll explain in a second. Some of them having nothing to do with the issue itself. And we reach a very quick conclusion based on our emotions. Then our reason comes in a very distant second, and we look for information that confirms the position that our emotions got us to. This is motivated reasoning. And so we all do it, and this creates the beginning of the divide. Where do those cognitive filters come from? Well, they come from our cultural identity. They come from who we associate with, the communities we're a part of. We want to fit with those around us. That could be your work, could be the profession of academia, it could be your political party affiliation, it could be your church or synagogue or mosque or temple, it could be your local farmers group, it could be any group that you identify with, and Dan Kahan describes this as cultural cognition. We start to form filters that reflect the identity of the cultures of which we're a part. We're becoming tribal, more so. So for example, my brother, who I love dearly, moved from Michigan to Texas. And I watched his politics slowly start to drift to the right. He was part of a cultural group, he was surrounded by information, and he starts to sway. Who do you see as a representative of that group? Certainly there are politicians or scientists that fall along the spectrum, and some we may accept and some we may reject. Who do you go to for news becomes a big part of our cultural identity, particularly in this country. You can go to Fox News, very conservative, right-leaning content. You can listen to National Public Radio, very left-leaning, liberal content. And there's actually survey data to show this is true, that the more you watch Fox News, the less you believe in climate change. The more you listen to NPR, the more you believe in climate change. This plays out. And then importantly, and we can't leave this out, social media is driving this. We create filter bubbles around ourselves. If any of you have unfriended somebody on Facebook because they posted something that you didn't agree with, you're creating your filter bubble, you're creating your cultural community, and you're homogenizing the content that you will receive through this medium. And this is critically important, and I think a big driver of the divisions we have in this country at this time. Number 3, cultural identity can overpower scientific reasoning. Psychologists like to describe we are cognitive misers. We have a certain amount of cognitive ability and we use it very frugally. And so, for example, Max Weber at the turn of the last century, the 1900s, described that we get through our day by activating black boxes. And what he meant by that was that I get in my car, I turn it on, I don't need to know how it works in order to get where I need to go. I get on a plane. I don't need to know how a jet engine works or air traffic control or TSA works. It just takes me where I need to go. I have food brought to me at a restaurant or at the grocery store. I don't need to know how I got there. I just buy it. If we had to open all those black boxes, we'd become an emotional and psychological cripple. So we find shortcuts. So do you believe in climate change? Well, I don't know. I trust the Sean Hannity on Fox News. He says it's a hoax. I'm going with that. My friend down the road seems to be very knowledgeable about science. She doesn't think it's real. I'm going with that. We look for these shortcuts. We are cognitive misers. And when we have to spend energy when we don't want to, it becomes very frustrating. I can remember, for example, the first time I went to an organic grocery store and I went to the cereal aisle and I was faced with a wall of cereal I'd never seen before. And so it was previously an automatic decision. I walk up, I grab my Cheerios, I walk out. Now required time, energy, and thought. And it annoyed me because if it took this long just to buy my box of cereal, this is going to be a very long and complicated and arduous grocery store trip. And so we get annoyed when we have to do that. We avoid doing that. We look for shortcuts. We do it because we want to, and in many ways we do it because we have to. A fourth piece of this that has to be brought out is our political and social economy creates resistance and inertia for change. There are many scientists who are quite surprised by the blowback from the fossil fuel industry, which in fact is quite predictable. The idea that an entire industry would start to accept a science that meant that they have to close down their industry without a fight, that's not going to happen. So you have forces out there questioning the science, bringing sometimes questionable information to the table. You have famous people on the right. I have Jenny McCarthy. You also have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. questioning the efficacy of vaccines, saying that they cause autism. National Geographic had a story. We have a war on science right now because people are questioning it, particularly when we have fake news out there. There's two on the left that I want to pay particular attention to because the public is getting confused with deliberate attempts to confuse them. So on the far left, This represents pseudoscientific journals. And if you're not familiar with them, be aware they're out there. If you are familiar with them, you're smirking right now. These are journals that are not rigorous at all. And if you just pay a certain amount of money, you can publish in those journals. And they will even contact you. I myself have been invited to be an editor-in-chief of a medical journal, an engineering journal. I have no credentials in that. They're fake journals, they're pseudoscientific. And so they're publishing papers. Some of them look like real science. Some of them don't. You can tell when they don't, but you can't tell when they do. And this is the problem in confusing the science. And so two scientists want to prove that these were a joke. And on the bottom left, this is an actual paper. You can go look it up. And excuse the language for 1 second. There's your trigger warning. The title of the paper is "Take Me Off Your Effing Mailing List." And he spelled out the word effing. And the paper is merely that sentence over and over again. And they got published merely by paying a price. We can look at that and say, obviously that's a joke. But there are plenty of papers out there that you can't tell. And they're not real science. And then right next to it, there's a book, and I put that in heavy quotation marks, called "Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming." This is not produced by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's produced by something oddly called the NIPCC, the Non-Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is actually produced by the Heartland Institute. It's a bunch of collections of articles and quote unquote research that says the scientists don't know if climate change is happening. The key is they produced this book, they produced tens of thousands of copies, and they sent them to K through 12 science teachers trying to affect K through 12 science curriculum in the United States. And there is the active attempt to distort the science that we have to be alert to. So all this leads to the conclusion that once our minds are made up and our position aligns with our cultural identity, providing additional scientific data can make us more resolute in resisting conclusions that are at variance with our cultural beliefs. The challenge is communication to overcome distrust. So another way to put this, you meet someone who doesn't believe climate change is real, or COVID, or vaccines, or any number of issues. And what do? Well, we whip out a PowerPoint deck and start to give them a science lesson, and they dig their heels in. So you think, well, they need more science. So you get another PowerPoint deck and you do it again, and they dig their heels in even harder because they have already seen this information and they are looking at it through a lens that gets them to distrust it. You need to understand the forms of that distrust before they'll listen to the science. It means you move to other dimensions of the debate, the subtext of the debate. What I want to offer from here is 4 forms of distrust that animate the climate change debate. Again, I might ask you, are there elements in Indian culture where these forces are at play? And why aren't this playing out on environmental issues and climate change in India? Is a very interesting question. And could it play out? Could these dynamics start to play forward? So I'll give you 4 forms of distrust, 4 ways to overcome them. And then I'm going to try and bring things up to date because the debate is changing very interestingly in the United States. And then I'll close with a story as I promised, and we'll open it up for questions. So the first form of distrust, people distrust the messenger. This is very important. The messenger is as important as the message. Andy Hoffman, professor at the University of Michigan, could say something. The Pope could say the exact same thing. A conservative talk show host could say the exact same thing. You will hear something very different from each of those 3 people, even though the words are the same. So who is saying it is very important for understanding how people respond to it. We've become very tribal. And so are they part of our tribe? If they are, I'll listen. If they're not, I won't. And one of the problems with climate change in this country is that the 3 primary spokespeople are environmentalists, democratic politicians, and scientists. And there are people in this country who distrust 1, 2, or all 3 of those. On the far right, environmentalists are seen as socialist, borderline communist, trying to use the state to control your life. They even have an expression. Environmentalists are called watermelons. They may be green on the outside, but they're red on the inside. I don't trust them. Democratic politicians is very easy to understand. The people on the right don't trust people on the left. And then scientists is quite interesting. And a lot of people are surprised by this, and you shouldn't be. A very famous book in 1964 won the Pulitzer Prize called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, described how there are many people who don't trust scientists. They don't trust us. Their perception is we live in an ivory tower. We're sipping our lattes or our Chardonnay all day. We work on issues they can't understand. We use a language they can't grasp. we have a disproportionate influence on the political process, I don't trust them. So if these are the spokespeople and people don't trust these messengers, we've got a problem. So what do? You need to find other messengers. We need to find what I'm calling climate brokers. So I want evangelical Christians to hear it from evangelical Christians. I want business people to hear it from business people. People need to hear it from people in their tribe. So if you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in climate change, figure out what tribe they're in and find spokespeople to represent their tribe. You can say the exact same thing, you'll get a different answer. And to my mind, the two most important brokers we need are from the market and from the political right. The second form of distrust, they distrust the process that created the message. And as my potential donor at the beginning of this presentation said, he thought the scientific review process is corrupt. I will add that he never gave us any money, so that takes care of that. But the argument is that, first of all, universities are left-leaning institutions, therefore they have a strong left-leaning bias. It's not entirely untrue. Their also belief is that you will not get published unless you satisfy the political interests of editors. You will not get grants unless you satisfy the political interests of grantors. That is not true. And so they distrust the scientific review process, and they distrust the United Nations, and they definitely distrust the IPCC. Many people see this as a threat to our sovereignty. How do you get over this? Well, there is very strong evidence, empirical evidence, that once you get someone to believe that there's a scientific consensus, they start to believe that climate change is real. And I will start here. When I face somebody who's disbelieving of climate change, I'll start with 200 scientific agencies around the world say this is real. They endorse the IPCC consensus statement. That includes every one of the G8 plus 5 countries. That's good enough for me. What information do you have that the scientists don't have? And that can work. It's tricky because you're going to have to get them to back down on a position they've held for a while. But that is a very strong position to take, because at the end of the day, while people say they don't trust science, they actually do every time they go to a hospital, every time they help their son or daughter with their chemistry or biology homework, anytime they take advantage of the benefits of science in our society. And a second element is separate the problem from the solution. A lot of people say, I don't believe in climate change because I don't want to see a carbon tax. And your answer is, that would be an honest debate to say, I think climate change is real, but I think a carbon tax is a bad idea. And you got to be careful to separate those two. The third form of distrust, they distrust the message. And this one to me is, if nothing else illustrates the subtext and how powerful it is, this one does. I'll go to the second one first, because I think this is so potent. There are a lot of people believe that you cannot believe in God and believe in climate change at the same time. There's a very famous conservative talk show host who just passed away, Rush Limbaugh, devoted an entire episode saying you can't believe in God and believe in climate change at the same time, with the argument that the idea that humans have become so powerful that they can change the global climate, to them is hubris. God is in charge out there. We're not in charge out there. We live by God's providence. I got heckled at a talk one time, someone holding up a Bible and saying, climate change cannot be happening because God promised Noah he would never flood the earth again. If you present that person with more science, you can see right away, you're not going to get any headway. You need to find another way through. People also have discomfort with climate scenarios. When people put out the worst case scenario, a lot of people just shut down. You know, the movie The Day After Tomorrow, if you've ever seen that, with Manhattan underwater and glaciers moving down Madison Avenue, people just dismiss that as really silly. In fact, David King at Oxford has a book on climate change. And one aspect of it I really like, he has 2 appendices in the back. He says, this is what climate skeptics say, and this is why they're wrong. The other one says, this is what climate alarmists say, and this is why they're wrong. And he calls it climate porn. It's extreme, it's titillating, it's meant to excite, and it's totally false. And a lot of the climate alarmist arguments are that way. And so what do we do about this? Well, you find broker frames. You find a frame that works with your audience. For example, I talk about climate change to business audiences, and many times they're hesitant to hear the message. I don't talk about radiative forcing. I don't talk about carbon loading. I talk about operational efficiency, cost of capital, consumer demand, regulatory affairs. I put it in the language of business, and they grasp it. You could talk about climate change as a health issue. The Lancet has called it the #1 health issue of the 21st century. You can frame it as an issue of national security. You'll start to have migration, climate refugees. There has been a lot of research suggesting that The Syrian civil war has been exacerbated because of climate change, because a lot of people in the country cannot live off the land anymore, moving into cities, creating more crowding, more unemployment. You can frame it as standard risk management. I'm sitting in a house right now. I have fire insurance. Why? Well, if it burns down, I'm going to have a big hit to my finances. It's a low probability event, but it's a high consequence event. So if someone says, well, climate change, the impact, the odds are against it. I would disagree with that assessment, but if someone says that, yeah, but it's a low probability, but a high consequence event, you need to take out insurance. What kind of insurance on climate change? Investment in technology and behavior change. So any number of broker frames are out there. Economic, we can invest in the next generation of alternative mobility or renewable energy, or another country will buy it from them. Maybe you don't want to have that happen. There are many ways to reach people by putting it in a language, in a frame that they understand, that fits with their tribe. And the second, avoid cataclysmic scenarios. That's an interesting question, because a lot of people disagree with that. And I would be open to discussion on that, of whether that is right, because some people feel you really have to give people the worst case scenario to understand the scale of the issue before them. Finally, many people distrust the solutions that come from the message. You could advocate for a carbon price. In the United States, you've advocated for a very intrusive government program. In this country, the role of government in society is a raging debate. You've stepped on a landmine. And then you can say, well, and we need to have a global carbon price. And now you've talked about maybe the UN doing this, and now you've really stepped on a landmine, because a lot of people in this country are afraid of a one world government. So how do you get around it? Well, first of all, you move beyond the negative. Can you frame a response to climate change in the positive? And I believe that's starting to happen. As long as you frame climate change as a need for restraint, sacrifice, people are going to be resistant. But when you give people solutions, and the solutions are starting to emerge, they can start to adjust to this. And you can hang it on American or Indian ingenuity and competitiveness. You can hang it on a positive future. So when you face someone who doesn't believe climate change or COVID or anything else is not real, and you just present them with more science, try and think about this. This is the subtext of the debate. These are the issues on the table. This is the level at which you have to bring the conversation in order to get through. You need to overcome distrust, and that's important. Now, there is the beginning of the first part of my talk, the first 3/4 of my talk. I want to bring things up to date, because a lot is happening. So you remember that graph I showed you before, the difference between conservative and Republicans, Democrats and Democrats and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. It ended at 2010. You can see since 2010, there's been a steady upward climb. That period, 2009, 2010, is a period that something called ClimateGate happened, if you're familiar with the climate change debate. Some people hacked into some computers at the University of East Anglia. They read the emails. They tried to frame that the scientists were faking the data. They weren't. But that was sort of the low point in the debate over climate change. Since then, it's been coming up quite steadily. And in the American public, 71% now, in 2017, believe that climate change is real. Interestingly, as I told you, less believe that there's a scientific consensus. Again, that's an area of more study. I find that fascinating. Yes, it's happening, but I don't think scientists believe it's happening. I'd love to tease that out. In the last election, climate change and environmental protection were more important than jobs and started to rival economic growth, which is unheard of. And so these issues are rising in concern within the American public, and that's quite fascinating. Even the partisan divide is narrowing. As recent as 2018, or the survey was done in 2017, 68% of liberal to moderate Republicans think global warming is happening. 55% think it's mostly caused by humans. So the partisan divide is starting to weaken, and that will start to bring the debate down. And we'll see how this plays out, whether some politicians start to shift. But why is this happening? We can go back to my talk and see it in some of the empirical data. When you survey people, why are you changing your position? The answer is recent extreme weather events, the wildfires in California, the hurricanes in Houston. And this is important for reasons I'll get to. It's important that it happens here to people we know. And on the bottom there, in our society, people trust the weather forecaster. And more weather men, women are talking about climate change when they're talking about the extreme weather events and explaining it. And that is really starting to change. So the number 2 up there was arguments supporting the existence of climate change. Again, it's important who they come from. And this is all leading to people becoming more concerned about it. The Yale University does a survey every year. It's called 6 Americas. They do it for multiple countries. And they break people into 6 categories on climate change. It's actually not binary, yes or no. On the far left, you have alarmed. I'm really worried about this. This is a disaster. On the far right, I'm dismissive. This is a joke. But in the middle, you have the gray zone. You have the shades of gray. On the top, 2013. On the bottom, 2018. You can see in that period of time, those who are alarmed or concerned rose from 43% to 57%. Those who are doubtful or dismissive dropped from 27 to 20%. So the pendulum is swinging. People becoming more concerned about it. So much so that over that 5-year period, I think it's happening up 11%. I am worried about it up 16%. It will harm Americans 12%. It will harm me personally 11%. And this is really important because people have typically been able to dismiss climate change because they think it's going to happen to somebody else, someplace else, and in the future. Now it's happening to us here and now, and that changes the debate. And that's really important. So much so that, for example, the state of North Carolina in 2012 passed a law banning the use of scientific predictions of sea level rise in government documents, which was tremendously important for the real estate sector and the insurance sector. The insurance sector is having none of that anymore. And now in 2021, they are changing and trying to figure out how and whether to build seawalls to protect these coastal communities. It's happening to people we know. It's happening here. It's happening now. Another important part of the debate is that a new demographic has entered the debate. I think this is critically important. Typically on environmental issues, the constituency is indeterminate. On women's issues, we have women. On labor issues, we have labor. On the environment, who's an environmentalist? Everybody or nobody. Until on climate change, young people came forward and said, we are an aggrieved party. It's something you are doing to us, and it's not fair. I would add to this the social justice, the racial justice, environmental justice movement, where minority communities are coming out and saying, and it's affecting us disproportionately too. And now you have a clear social movement. You have a clear constituency, and they affect people around them. You know, academics don't believe anything unless we have data. So there was actually a paper that came out in 2019 in Nature Climate Change. Children can foster climate change concern among their parents. Basically, what this paper found was that parents love their children and listen to them and care about their future. I would also add employers care about young people because they're future employees, and they're starting to grab onto this in order to appeal to the younger base. I think as we start to think about climate change as a cultural issue, we can talk about the extent to which it's framed and people don't get it. We can also talk about the extent to which it's framed and it does connect with what people are concerned about. And so it's an environmental issue, yes. It's a scientific issue, yes. Is it a food issue? Is it an economic issue? Is it a health issue? As you can see those numbers grow, it's starting to penetrate our culture. And so for the final slides of my talk, before I get to my final story, I want to talk about it as an economic issue. And I'm looking at my clock and I may have to, I'm going to truncate a few slides just so we can get through this. But the economic frame is changing people's position on climate change. President Biden is talking about jobs, the economy, and addressing climate change. And that is starting to shift people's ideas, because if you put it in the economics, you're putting it in the area of solutions. Business students love this frame. We can actually solve climate change by being good business people. And if you look across the economy, any sector making its money, connecting its money to the land, to nature, is getting affected by climate change now through adaptation, mitigation, and so forth. Two sectors that I think are critically important: insurance. On the bottom left, that's a graph from Munich Re, a reinsurance company, showing a steady increase in the rise of natural disasters. I show this to skeptics, and it's quick to point out the messenger is important than the message. This is not the EPA, it is not Al Gore, this is an insurance company. They have no dog in this fight. And then next to that, look at the payouts. They're uncertain, they're erratic, and this is what makes insurance companies really uncomfortable. Look at the payouts for wildfires. And that's before the California wildfires, which are going to blow that number right through the roof. Such that in the upper left, surveyed by the Society of Actuaries last year, climate change climbed to the top of the list of emergent risks for the very first time. And insurance companies are changing the coverage and changing the cost. Finance is another driver, and this is critically important. The amount of ESG investing is growing rapidly. The amount of fossil fuel divestment is growing rapidly. The University of Michigan just announced yesterday they're going to divest from fossil fuels. And interestingly, during COVID, ESG investing has surged. So a lot of people are looking for something different from the corporations. On the bottom left, from why to why not, sustainable investing is the new normal. That's not from an environmental group, that's from McKinsey. And that really starts to change the debate. So I am going to jump ahead. I apologize, but I'm looking at the time and I want to have time for your questions. I think it's fascinating the extent to which the markets are shifting now and presenting us with solutions in ways that are disruptive and challenging. So the auto sector. Anyone who doesn't recognize that the future of the auto sector is electric. I'm here in Detroit, I'm here in the auto world, and everyone in the auto sector knows it. And then right behind it, autonomous vehicles. Renewable energy, growing rapidly. And then at the bottom, I throw this in just for fun, the best IPO in 2019 was Impossible Burger. Vegetable-based meats are taking off. And right behind it, insect-based proteins, cricket farms are growing. When I was born in 1961, there were 3 billion people on Earth. Today, there are 7.5. By 2050, there are going to be 10 billion people. Can everyone have the amount of meat that we eat, particularly in the United States today? No. We have to find new ways of sourcing protein, and those markets are growing. And you can see, particularly on the top two, this blows my mind. I mean, look at the market cap for Tesla, $640 billion. And I made this graph like a month ago. It's been a little erratic since then, but look at the orders of magnitude. GM, it's 10 times the market cap for GM. That's just incredible. Look at the energy sector. Next era energy, Enel, Iberdrola. Their market cap is rivaling ExxonMobil, Shell, BP. There's moving money into the fossil fuel sector, a lot of attention to it lately. It's a short-term play. The renewable energy sector is the long-term play. The market sees where this is going. Even to the point where the American Petroleum Institute is coming out with a document endorsing a carbon price to meet the Paris Accord. Times are changing. The markets are shifting. Business has a role to play in this. To my mind, business has the role to play in it. If business doesn't solve this problem, it won't be solved. But I also think they change the discourse. If business is doing something about it and finding a way through, it creates jobs, it creates economic growth, and it becomes easier, more palatable to accept. So I wanted to bring things up to date with that. As promised, I want to close with a story to try and illustrate what I've tried to get across in this talk. I'll try and do this very quickly so we can get to your questions. So after I met with my potential donor who didn't give us any money, I started my work on trying to develop the stream on climate change as a cultural issue. So my first paper was in organizational dynamics. Perhaps some of you have read this journal. All I was trying to do was connect the theory on culture with the empirical information on climate change. And I had two throwaways. They were kind of the editor asked me to leave them in, but I was trying to illustrate with examples. So surrogates in humans health, and I talked about that earlier in the talk, that it took a while for us to accept that cigarettes cause cancer. And it really was a culture shift to come to that recognition, both in terms of this product and how we viewed it, but also the role of government of effectively restraining a legitimate sector, a strong sector in certain states. And I said, how big is the culture shift before us? I said, as big as the abolition of slavery. I was quick to say, you can't make a direct comparison between the wanton cruelty of one race against another, but there are some interesting parallels. When abolitionists stood on the street corners of London and said we have to abolish slavery, people said, you're out of your mind, you're going to ruin our quality of life. The entire economy is based on it. Today, people are saying we have to abolish fossil fuels. And people are saying you're out of your mind, you're going to ruin our quality of life. The entire economy is based on it. And at the time of slavery, many people thought it was part of the moral order. There are slaves in the Bible. So what's the problem here? And I would ask you, I would ask anyone, can you even imagine a day where we would look at the emission of CO2 with even remotely the moral overtones that we look at slavery? I'll bet you can't. And that's how big the culture shift is before us. And so the paper came out, and it's an organizational dynamics. I don't know how many people read it, probably not many. But then something funny happened. The New York Times picked it up, and Scientific American picked it up. Even Time magazine picked it up, and they all picked up on that abolition analogy. And so I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. I'm a public intellectual. People are reading my work. And I was new to this debate. I did not know how toxic it had become until a colleague sent me an email saying, I see Mark Morano is taking his hits at you. And I said, who's Mark Morano? And he said, he used to work for Rush Limbaugh, a conservative talk show host. He used to work for James Inhofe, a conservative senator of the United States who has been mocking climate change as a hoax. And he has a webpage called climatedepot.com, and I think you really better go look at it. So I looked at it, and this is what I found. And you can see my picture on the bottom, and next to it is a picture of Adolf Hitler. And the coverage of the article is primarily this: climate skeptics are the moral equivalent of those who defended slavery. And then there's my email address. And the emails start coming in. And I saved them, and I've gotten them since. I have a folder in my inbox called Climate Skeptic Hate Mail. And I get it because I write about climate change. And at first, it puzzled me. What am I supposed to do with this? I was stunned. I've never gotten this kind of stuff before. What do I make of it? And I thought, well, are there ways to use this to illustrate what I'm describing? And I think I can. In this, you can see distrust of science. I'm a criminal. CO2 is plant food. Are you stupid? Your days of milking the system with your phony science are numbered. You self-appointed overseers expect us peasants will take you and your fellow scientists, quote, seriously. You're a scientist, I don't trust you. You're arrogant, you're self-appointed, I don't trust you. They distrust my ideology. I must be working for Satan. I'm a green terrorist. I must be a secular evolutionist. This person's putting me in a tribe. If I believe in climate change, I must not believe in God, and I must believe in evolution. And they distrust the impact. Why do I want to force the United States to lower its standard of living to pursue my fantasies? Why do you want to de-develop the world and push us backwards? Greetings, comrade. Why are you looking for the Marxist destruction of civilization? You must be a socialist or a communist. You're going to destroy the economy. And so I would leave my talk with one question to drive the point home. Why would people send emails like this to someone they don't know over a scientific issue? And that's because for them, it is not a scientific issue. For them, they are defending values that they hold dear, and they will defend them very, very vehemently. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'll stop screen sharing, and we'll open up to your questions.
Thank you, Andy. Really insightful talk. So we can take some questions. Okay, I do see some hands raised. It would also be helpful if you could type your questions. Yeah. So we have a few questions already. Andy, you can take the questions in any order that you like.
Okay. Yeah, for some reason I can't scroll on my chat.
Do you want me to read them out?
What's the first one? I can't read it.
Yeah, so the first one is from Priya Narayanan, and the question is, are you suggesting that the issue you initially highlighted took care of itself over time without too much human intervention?
No, not at all. An important thing about events is that they are not objective occurrences. Events are socially constructed. And so as these events are happening, they have to be framed in a certain way that shifts the debate. You can go back to Thomas Kuhn and the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. If you frame events as discontinuities that challenge the culture, the norms, the beliefs that we have at the time, then you can create a discontinuity and a new set of beliefs. It requires social activists, social movements to try and push the debate. Certainly, events are important. These are occurrences that happen, but in the famous words of Winston Churchill, never waste a good crisis. Frame it in a certain way in order to drive social change. So it is not taking care of itself over time. It's a continuous push and debate. Okay.
Okay, so there is a comment rather than a question. Yeah. You may want to respond to that.
All major EU utilities are diversified to reduce their carbon portfolio. We're seeing this across the board. You can see some of the slides I jumped through. If you had asked me 5 or 6 years ago what I thought about carbon neutrality, I would have thought that would have stayed a conversation among academics. But I am really impressed the extent to which it has entered the corporate conversation. And there are a lot of companies, there are even some countries, New Zealand, Costa Rica, Iceland, who are pledging to go carbon neutral. Now, the proof is always in the pudding. A lot of them are jumping straight to offsets, which I think is not really doing it, but some are. And some companies, Microsoft, IKEA, are actually pledging to go carbon negative. And I find this fascinating because if you don't ask the right question, you're not going to find the answers. Now, again, don't trust them, track them. But the idea that carbon neutrality has entered the conversation, that companies and countries are starting to look to do it, to my mind, means that perhaps we'll find the answers we're looking for. Okay, I see a question from Pretty Sharma. Professor Hamilton, you spoke about a shift in the way people are getting more aware about effects of climate change. Can you say that now people are sensitized towards addressing the current issues towards the climate shift happening? Do we have a research on the same? Sensitized, yeah. I mean, I brought up that there's an interesting debate over whether you should bring in catastrophic scenarios. And in 2017, New York Magazine had a cover story, and it was the Doomsday Scenario. And this writer just laid out all the worst case scenarios. It was a very scary article, things like the Gulf Stream stopping, things like that, all the ice sheets melting, and what would happen. And it's interesting what happened. First of all, it became the best-selling issue of New York Magazine in their history. So people loved it. He got a book contract right away, and the book is out. It's called The Uninhabitable Earth. And then if you look at the letters to the editor of the subsequent issue, take a look. It's a fascinating debate. This is irresponsible. You shouldn't do it. No, we have to do it. We have to give people the full scenario. I look at that and I think it really raises an interesting question, because psychologists have been saying, we're developing these psychoses in people over climate change, and giving them a worst case scenario just scares them. And especially if they don't have an ability, any agency to do any action, they start to shut down. I wonder, though, as these events start to happen, especially as they start to get labeled climate change, are people being sensitized such that they can be open to issues and questions around climate change? I think it's a progression. And the more we hear about it, you can push the boundary further and the debate continues. So is there research on this? There's a lot of research in the social and the psychological realm on climate change, but there's room for plenty more. And again, we have just been, if you want a rich empirical site, study human reaction to COVID. This is an unbelievable natural experiment we're sitting through right now, and similar phenomena of being presented with scientific information that has tremendous economic implications and therefore becomes highly politicized. And what do we do about it? And especially on the global stage, a lot of comparisons between climate change and COVID in terms of our global institutions, and are they able to respond to the challenges that we face? Certainly we got some tested, they bent, some of them broke, and what are we going to do from here? Yeah, I cannot scroll, so if you can read the questions to me, I can go with that.
Sure. So there's a question from Deepthi Ganapathy, and the question is, what's your opinion on the role of news media's framing of the debate?
It's critically important. And what is the news media now? I mean, we have all these terms now: new media, old media, social media, mainstream media. We're awash in information. And if you want to read a really interesting study on this, the RAND Corporation, and basically our Defense Department think tank, they came out with a study 2 years ago. It's called Truth Decay. And they came up, it was a very interesting study. They came up with 4 conclusions. 1, we're debating facts. 2, we're blurring fact and opinion. 3, we're distrusting previously trusted sources of information, which, by the way, is us, academia. 4, we've never seen anything like that. And they put social media as a big driver of that. So you can now go to social media. I heard a marketing executive say at one time, the problem with social media, it doesn't make us more informed, it makes us more resolute in our positions. And so I can go to the web and find position for anything I want to find. And so that is confusing the debate. And let's not delude ourselves. There are people out there trying to use social media to deliberately confuse the debate. And I feel very strongly that this places the challenge, the gauntlet, at the door of the academy. Creation of knowledge, creation of information is our stock and trade. And if we don't step into this breach and try and do something about this, who will? Who is a trusted broker on this? And I think it's us. And I think that we have to start to shift the norms of academia so that it's not just A-level publications that are focused on narrow academic communities. We need to start to change the norms so we bring the work out into the world and inform public and political discourse. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble.
Great. There's another question on, as you said, people are getting sensitized, but the question is, do we have any statistics and research that this awareness creation or the fact that events are actually creating awareness and common people and corporations are actually acting?
All we have is survey data, and that's self-reporting. It would be a really great set of studies to try and create, explore the causal mechanisms there. When does an event cause a shift? How is the framing of that event catalyzing that shift? What kind of information comes in that get people to listen? What communities will listen to what kind of messaging? And again, we could be talking about climate change. We could talk about any number of issues, but I think there's a rich area here for further research. No one's taken me up on my challenge of why isn't this happening in India? Anyone have any ideas?
Yeah, so why are we on the top of the list there that you started with, right?
And why is the United States at the bottom?
And we see Japan, under United States. Would you like to take that now, or?
If any, now or later, but I'm very curious if there are any hypotheses in this group.
Sir, is it the possibility of the number of people who were interviewed? Maybe that could be.
Do you think that there is a vibrant climate skeptic community in India?
Could be. If you go into the smaller regions, maybe there might be people who are more skeptic towards climate change and something happening to the climate because of our actions. They see it as like more from a maybe a religious view or like other kind of spiritual views that they subscribe to.
But it's interesting that you say could be, because in the United States, everyone would say without a hesitation, there absolutely is. So the fact that you're not sure is interesting to me.
Professor Hoffman, could that be the reason?
I would request you all to please, type in your comments.
I apologize. I taunted people into the conversation.
No, that's okay.
But Himanshu was about to say something, and I'm curious. Did you have something?
I was just asking about the same thing in continuation to what Bhavesh said, that why US is at the bottom and India is the top. Could be the reason of ideological subversion, which have played over the generation, and people undoubtedly, out of no reason, they have to doubt the institution, which is current institution in the place, any narrative which they bring in, and they would just oppose it.
I mean, I have no quick answer for you. Some would hypothesize that, the global treaties on climate change have, the clean development mechanism, joint implementation, ways of move money from developing to other countries as a way to offset their emissions. And would India be a recipient of that aid rather than someone paying that aid? May make it easier to accept. But if the money was flowing out, maybe it'd be more of a concern. I don't know. This is a great research question.
So there's a question from Vinayak, which is, when we use the organizational or institutional theory framework for analyzing policy debates, do we risk falling into the grand theorizing trap?
I've always been, fascinated the extent to which people view institutional theory with very, very strong suspicion as this hegemony that's taking over the field, and fair enough. Yeah, I mean, theories are only useful to a certain point, and then they become constraints. I'm getting editorial now. This is not the view necessarily of my employer, but my colleague Jerry Davis gave a presentation one time that I really liked. He said, theories are convenient lies. And what he meant by that was that every model is wrong, but it's convenient. And for example, he showed an illustration. He showed a map of the subway system in London, the tube system. Very orderly, lines, everything's a grid. If you've ever been, you see. And then he showed a picture of what it really looks like, and it was spaghetti. It was a mess. It was so complicated, you could never make sense out of it. That map was incorrect, but it was a useful model. And so institutional theory has grown in its influence, but it's by definition incorrect. So what is it missing? To my mind, it misses issues of power. It's sort of moved around in terms of change, dealing with that. And I've been frustrated, and I think this is true across the board, of its agnosticism over the outcomes. It just looks at outcomes. Well, that's what it is. And is it a good outcome? Not my problem. Is it the power dominating the weak? Not my problem. And that totally ignores some major realities in our world, that that one institution is the same as another, driven by different constituents. To leave out power, I think, is just a gaping hole. And so how do we evolve it? And how do we use what we can, throw out what we don't want to use? I struggle when I hear people just slavishly follow a theory. A theory is a tool, like a hammer or a saw. Don't use a hammer to try saw wood. Don't use institutional theory where it's not as strong or as robust as it should be, but uses pieces that can be, and go from there. And the journals, I think, are set against us in that, unfortunately. I think they become very dogmatic about theory, particularly the A journals. And there's some very interesting phenomenon that there's some scientists, a Nobel Prize winning chemist, who has announced he and his lab will never publish in what he calls the vanity journals of his field, Science, Nature, and Cell. Because he says they constrain what's considered legitimate research, because it becomes a very narrow stream, and it kind of kills the more entrepreneurial work that's out there. I once interviewed Paul Krugman, and I asked him, most of the work you got the Nobel Prize for was in B journals. Why did you do that? And you know what his answer was? It was because the A's wouldn't take it. And the A's were just too narrow in their thinking of what is considered good research. I mean, I've moved a lot of my work. I'll still publish in the academic journals, aim for the A's, largely for my doctoral students. But now that I'm full, and I'm moving more towards books. Books give me more freedom, and people read books, not just in the academic community, but outside of academia. And that's my goal now as a full professor. But I remember once talking to my advisor, and he laughed, and he said, Andy, everyone reads my books but cites my articles. I just love that line. I thought it was very funny. And I think that is true. So I'm ranting. I'm sorry about that.
Great. Let's take a couple more questions. So Dr. Ram Mohan Turaga, his question is, powerful corporate interests are going to continue to create counterframes to the frames you discussed. How would one deal with it?
Yeah.
And this is particularly important, he says, because there is increasing scientific consensus that we need radical transformation from a fossil fuel economy, and that too very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, that brings the politics into institutional theory. Institutional theory is not going to be able to capture this dynamic, and that's a huge mistake. And there are efforts to try and amend that. On an empirical sense, I mean, to begin with, one way that corporations are able to do this is because government has been so weakened in its ability. And an issue I have with our approach in business and our approach in business school is I am stunned how many students, how many people in general think that government has no role in the market, that regulation is an unwarranted intrusion in the market, like the market is some kind of natural state and regulation is separate from it. When in fact, regulation sets the rules of the market. And I taught a course last year for the first time called Business and Democracy. And I had students reading things like Adam Smith. And if you read Adam Smith did not trust corporations at all and really felt strongly that you cannot have a viable market without a strong rule of government. Governments become weakened, both on the national scene and on the global scene. And so how do we bring the government back in as a countervailing force against corporations? Then you can go to the next step. What is holding back politicians from taking steps that may offend incumbent industries, particularly fossil fuels? And then you can start to look towards questions like lobbying, campaign financing, the constituency. A lot of politicians are afraid to rile the fossil fuel industry because they feel the constituency is going to vote them out of office. If you can compel them to recognize that actually things are starting to shift, and if you look at the jobs, for example, frame the shift on jobs, on the economy, certainly there are some regions that are still heavily dependent on coal, natural gas, oil, but some that are diversifying and finding that the jobs in wind or solar are rivaling those in fossil fuels. And now the balance of power starts to shift. And how do you exploit that to recognize that the weakening power of the fossil fuel industry and the growing power of the new entrants as a way to start to shift the conversation?
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more. So Pranay Jaini asks why the focus only on industrial decarbonization. Agriculture contributes to a large proportion of climate change, contributed to climate change. How are we going to handle that?
I lump agriculture into industrial. Industrial agriculture is a big issue, and again, I make a game out of this almost. Whenever I meet someone who makes money off the land, it's largely agriculture. I say, "Do you see climate change?" And I get one of two answers. I'll get either, "Yeah, of course I do." I remember talking to a coffee grower saying, "I'm growing species I never grew before. I can't grow species I used to grow. I'm seeing pests I never saw before. I'm irrigating fields I never irrigated before. Of course I see it." The other answer I'll get is, "I'm not ready to call it climate change. That's that liberal agenda thing, but something weird is going on here. And I've never seen anything like this before." And I've heard plenty of farmers say that. So the agriculture sector is starting to wake up to it, even to the point, we had the CEO of Cargill on campus a couple of years ago, and we had a private lunch with him, and I had some climate scientists there. And we asked him, "Do you see climate change?" He goes, "Absolutely." We said, "Why don't you come out and say something?" Because he said, "My constituency will kill me. It's all conservative farmers and ranchers." He's recently come out and said, "Okay, folks, climate change is real. We need to do something about it." General Mills is starting to do it. And so the agriculture sector is starting to wake up to it. And to my mind, the most important piece of that is in the meat sector and shifting away from animals and more towards vegetable-based meats, more towards insect-based proteins, more, I'm not going to advocate for a vegetarian lifestyle. I think that, I think it's great. And maybe there's a piece of the Indian culture that would come into this conversation as a big difference in the American culture, where in America, you not only have a piece of meat every night, but it's a huge piece of meat. The amount of meat we eat, and China is racing to catch up to us. We have to change that, or we're in serious trouble. So I think of agriculture as part of the industrial system that's dealing with these issues.
Great. One last question. Dr. Ankur Sareen asks, my sense is that climate nationalism will probably start dominating these debates. And if we keep accommodating all worldviews, do those values come to be challenged at all?
That's a very interesting question, because that would fit with more recent trends: Donald Trump, nationalism, balkanism, breaking down global institutions. To my mind, COVID exposed the dangers and the hazards of that, because COVID doesn't respect national boundaries, and you start to close down global trade, the economics are starting to be felt. To my mind, the key is framing climate change in a language that resonates with the culture in which you're talking. And I go back to that slide. Is it an economic issue? Is it a national security issue? There are many frames and there are ways to bring it out, but climate nationalism will be a serious problem because this is something we have to work on together, collectively, globally. To my mind, it's a challenge the likes of which humanity's never seen. COVID gave us a test. Drug companies are coming in to save the day, we hope. So there's a nice silver bullet. Everyone's looking for that silver bullet on climate change, whether it's carbon sequestration or whether it's fusion, cold fusion, or advanced nuclear, just some silver bullet to solve it so I can go on living the way I did before. But at the end of the day, our cultures do have to shift, and they will shift. The whole literature on the history of science and the connections, structuration, connection between technology and culture, I think are completely relevant here. And the whole notion that we've entered the Anthropocene compels a shift in our culture of how we see ourselves, how we see nature, and how we see the two connected. That will play out differently in different cultures. And the interesting question is how? How does it look differently in India as opposed to the United States, as opposed to China? And to find that frame that works in that context.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Andy, for an extremely insightful talk. And I think we had a great Q&A session. So thank you